Everyone keeps saying Wuthering Waves needs more tragedy, but I don't think that would actually make the story better. In fact, it might break it. Is Wuthering Waves even suitable for a tragedy? Right now, one of the loudest discussions around the game is that it needs more tragedy, higher stakes, a darker direction. And it's not just this game either. We see the same thing across the gacha space, where a pretty large part of the community keeps asking for that kind of shift. With version 3.3 right around the corner and everything surrounding AMED approaching its peak, that conversation only gets louder. But at this point, the question isn't really whether we can save her anymore. If you've been following the story up to now and still expect anything else, you're probably missing what the game has already been setting up. So the discussion moves somewhere else. It's no longer about what will happen, but about what people want to happen. And that's where the problem starts. Because there's one question that almost never comes up, and it should be the starting point for all of this. Is Wuthering Waves even built for a darker, more tragic outcome in the first place? If the foundation isn't there, adding tragedy doesn't fix anything, it just creates a different set of problems. So to answer that, we need to step back and look at something more fundamental. What tone actually does in storytelling, and whether the tone Wuthering Waves has established can support that kind of direction at all. Let's get into it. The weird thing is, Wuthering Waves already has everything people are asking for. If we look at the broader conversation in the community, it usually comes down to the same few things: more consequences, higher stakes, and a protagonist that fails more often. And honestly, I find that a bit strange, because Wuthering Waves already has all of these elements. Take failure for example. The idea that Rover doesn't fail, or doesn't fail enough, doesn't really hold up when you look at the story as a whole. Rover is, in many ways, a protagonist defined by failure. The entire reason they exist in their current state is because they failed their original mission, which led to the decision to erase their memories and start over. Even if we narrow the scope and focus only on the current conflict surrounding Amet, the same pattern is still there. The situation unfolds the way it does because Rover failed to stop her from sacrificing herself. That alone is already a major turning point. We can push it even further. Choosing to erase their memories didn't just reset Rover, it also meant abandoning any chance of staying by Amet's side, of being a guiding presence in her life. If they had remained, there's a real possibility that things wouldn't have escalated to this point, that she might not have become the Exos Rider's resonator at all. That in itself is another layer of failure. So when people say that the protagonist doesn't fail, it feels disconnected from what the story is actually showing. Failure is everywhere in Rover's narrative, it's constant, it just doesn't always take the form people expect, and winning in the end doesn't erase that. A successful outcome doesn't invalidate the failures that led up to it, just like it doesn't remove the weight of the stakes involved, because those are there too. In the current conflict, the stakes are very clear. If we fail, Amet dies, Aleph 1 breaks through the Strider's Gate and everything collapses. The scale of the consequences is already established. This is where a lot of the misunderstanding comes in. Stakes are not there to guarantee a tragic outcome, they exist to define what could happen if things go wrong. Whether the story ends on a good or bad note doesn't diminish the weight of that possibility. The same applies to consequences. Amet's situation doesn't exist in isolation, it's directly tied to Rover's past decision, to their failures. The consequences are already part of the narrative, they're just not always framed in the way people expect. So when we look at all of these complaints together, it doesn't really come down to these elements being absent, it's that people want more of them. And at that point the discussion shifts, it's no longer about whether the story is doing something wrong, it becomes about wanting a different kind of story altogether. And to some extent that reaction makes sense. The issue isn't that Wuthering Waves lacks stakes or failure or consequences, it's that those elements don't always lead to meaningful change. They don't reshape the narrative in a way that makes them feel impactful over time. And that's a much broader problem, not just limited to this game. Gacha storytelling in general tends to struggle with this. Change, especially when it comes to the protagonist, is often limited, or delayed, or simply avoided. As a result, even when failure or consequences exist, they can feel weaker than they should. That's usually what creates the impression that something is missing, not the absence of these elements, but the lack of lasting impact behind them. So naturally, the solution people gravitate towards is asking for more failure, more loss, more tragedy. But more isn't really the answer. What matters is whether those elements actually change something. Without that, increasing the intensity doesn't fix the problem, it just makes it more visible. Now, that brings us to the other major point people keep asking for, a darker, more tragic direction for the story. And that's where the real question begins. Is Wuthering Waves even built for that kind of storytelling in the first place? To put it simply, tone in storytelling is the feeling a story creates, both when you experience it and when it's being written. It's the emotional lens through which everything is filtered, and more importantly, it quietly tells you what kind of story you're stepping into. You can think of it like this: when you open a book and read the first page, you already get a sense of what you're dealing with. Not in terms of plot, but in terms of direction, what kind of journey this is going to be, and what kind of outcomes feel possible within it. The same applies to games. Within the first few minutes of playing, the story establishes a baseline. It signals how serious the world is, how far it's willing to go, and what kind of emotional payoff you should expect. That initial impression matters more than people realize, because tone doesn't just set the mood, it sets the boundaries. A good example of this is Punishing Grey Raven, Kuro's other game. It doesn't take long for the story to communicate what it is. The atmosphere is heavy, the world feels hostile, and the narrative makes it clear very early on that things are not going to end well for everyone involved. There's a certain weight to everything, and that weight tells you something important. Tragedy isn't an exception in that story, it's part of the foundation. That's what a strong tone does. It aligns expectation with delivery. You understand what kind of story you're in, and the story follows through on that promise. Now, tone isn't something that has to remain completely static. It can shift between characters, it can soften or intensify depending on the scene, and different arcs can explore slightly different emotional spaces, but underneath all of that, there needs to be a consistent core. The overall direction can't contradict itself, because the moment it does, the story starts to feel unstable. That consistency is what allows the audience to trust the narrative. When we move to Wuthering Waves, the difference becomes very clear. The world itself isn't free of tragedy. There are losses, there are heavy moments, and the setting carries its own share of darkness. But the way the story presents those elements is different. It doesn't frame them as the natural endpoint of the narrative. Instead, they exist within a structure that constantly leans toward resolution rather than collapse. From the beginning, the tone signals something important. This is a story where things can go wrong, sometimes very wrong, but the trajectory doesn't point towards irreversible loss as the final outcome. Even when the situation looks bleak, the expectation isn't that everything will fall apart, it's that there will be a way forward. That distinction matters, because tone doesn't remove tragedy, it determines how far that tragedy is allowed to go. If we look at the current conflict surrounding Ahmed, that idea becomes even more visible. On the surface, the stakes are high, the situation is serious, but the framing never really suggests that the story is building towards a completely tragic resolution. Even outside the main narrative, small details reinforce that direction. Take the preview for the second part of version 3.3. After the confrontation with Aleph 1, there's a brief line about the Space Trek Collective and Star Torch Academy gradually returning to normal operations. It doesn't spell out exactly what happens, and it doesn't confirm the full resolution, but the tone of that line alone tells us a lot. It points towards recovery, towards continuation, not towards a complete breakdown. And that fits perfectly with the identity the story has established so far. Because at its core, Wuthering Waves isn't built around tragedy as its endpoint. It allows for struggle, for failure, for difficult moments, but it doesn't structure itself around the idea that everything will eventually collapse into loss. That doesn't make the story weaker, it just means it's aiming for a different kind of emotional payoff. And this is where the main issue comes in. Pushing the story towards a significantly darker or more tragic direction wouldn't just be a small adjustment, it would require breaking the tone that has been established from the very beginning. 2 years into the story, that foundation is already set. Changing it now wouldn't feel like natural evolution, it would feel like a contradiction. Would the game do it? Technically yes, but it wouldn't come without a cost. Because once you disrupt that consistency, the story loses its sense of direction, the audience no longer knows what to expect, and the emotional weight of future moments become harder to trust. At that point, you're not strengthening the narrative, you're destabilizing it. Now, it's completely fair for people to want something different. Preference and storytelling are always subjective. Some people are drawn to darker, more tragic narratives, where loss is permanent and outcomes are uncertain. Others prefer stories that lean more towards resolution and recovery. I fall closer to the second group. I generally don't gravitate towards heavily tragic stories, which is part of the reason why I enjoy Wuthering Waves more than something like Punishing Grey Raven. That doesn't make one better than the other, it just means they're built for different audiences. And that's the key point. If you're looking for a story where tragedy is the dominant force, where failure leads to irreversible loss, Wuthering Waves might not fully satisfy that expectation. Not because it's doing something wrong, but because that was never the kind of story it set out to be. That direction, that balance between struggle and resolution is part of its identity, and once that identity is established, you don't change it without consequences. Now, this is where things start to matter a bit more, because it's one thing to say that a story is built for a certain kind of outcome, but the real question is what actually happens if you try to force it anyway? And the answer is, it doesn't make the story feel darker or more impactful, it just makes it feel off. The first problem is that tragedy stops feeling earned. If a story hasn't been building towards that kind of outcome, if the tone hasn't been preparing you for it, then when it finally happens, it doesn't land the way it's supposed to. Instead of feeling like a natural conclusion, it comes across as something that was inserted for the sake of shock or intensity. You don't really process it as part of the narrative, you question it. And once that happens, the emotional weight is already gone. Then there's the issue of character consistency. Characters don't exist in isolation. The way they act, the decisions they make, all of that is shaped by the world they're in and the tone that world establishes. When the story suddenly shifts into a much darker direction without properly setting it up, those same characters can start to feel out of place. Either they react in ways that don't match the severity of the situation, or the situation itself feels disconnected from how the story has been presenting them up to that point. It creates a kind of disconnect where nothing quite lines up anymore. But the biggest problem is what it does to trust. Tone teaches you how to read a story. It tells you what kind of outcomes are possible, how seriously to take certain threats, and what kind of resolution you should be preparing for. Over time, you build a sense of understanding with the narrative. You know how it operates. If that suddenly changes without proper build-up, that understanding breaks. And once that trust is gone, it's very hard to get it back. Because now, every moment that's supposed to carry weight becomes uncertain in the wrong way. Not uncertain in the sense that anything could happen, but uncertain in the sense that you don't really know what the story is trying to be anymore. At that point, increasing the level of tragedy doesn't strengthen the narrative, it just exposes the fact that the foundation wasn't built to support it in the first place. At the end of the day, this isn't really about whether Wuthering Waves needs more tragedy, it comes down to understanding what kind of story it's trying to tell in the first place. Once that's clear, a lot of these expectations start to lose their weight. Not every story is built around loss, and pushing it in that direction doesn't make it stronger, it just pulls it away from its own foundation. And it doesn't really stop at Wuthering Waves, you see the same pattern across a lot of gacha games. These stories already have stakes, failure and consequences. What's usually missing is how they come together, how they actually build something meaningful over time. And when that part finally works, the difference is immediately noticeable. Wuthering Waves doesn't need more tragedy, it needs to become better at using the one it already has. If you've played something like Enfield, you've probably already seen that shift. I went into that in my previous video, breaking down why version 1.2 is the first time its story really comes together. So if you want to see what that looks like on the other side, you can check that out right here.